Our wood stove has been condemned by HETAS. In the UK, HETAS is the organisation that maintains a register of supposedly competent installers and servicing businesses for heating appliances like wood burners, stoves and boilers. It operates as a way for registered installers to self-certify that their work meets building regulations instead of involving a local authority, i.e. building control. The story begins in 2022 when we had this wood stove installed by a HETAS registered company. We paid £2,529, and for us getting a wood stove to heat part of our home just made sense as we have a constant supply of free fuel in the form of timber because of the work that I do. Once it was installed, we were issued with a HETAS certificate of compliance, and from our perspective, we thought the installer had done a good job. They communicated well, turned up when they said they would, and were very clean and tidy. Shortly after we had it installed, I made a video about it focusing on wood stove pollution and PM2.5 particle emissions, which I'm not going to talk about in this video because my feelings on that are the same now as they were back then. But when I made that video, I got a number of comments around concerns about our installation. Comments about the proximity of the wood stove to the curtains, the architrave, the skirting board, etc, etc. Obviously, I'm no expert on this stuff, so I wrote to the installer for confirmation that it was compliant, and they responded saying basically that it was. After doing a bit more research myself, I found that there really is no blanket rule for a safe distance to combustibles for wood stoves. There is a general rule, which is 3 times the flue diameter, meaning if you have a 150mm diameter, the distance should be 450mm. There should, however, be manufacturer's guidelines for each and every stove, and after doing some research, I found out that the minimum distance from combustibles for our specific stove is 375mm. Our stove, however, had been installed just 160mm from a door architrave. So I went back to the installer to double check, and this is where things are going to get very, very weird. So weird, in fact, that it really creeps me out every time I think about it, even now over 3 years later. The installer's response said, "To confirm your installation meets regulations and is compliant, the picture below is from a HETAS installer training video. It's almost identical to your installation." The picture he included in that email was a screenshot of the YouTube video that I had made of me sitting next to my wood stove. Yeah, let that sink in for a minute. I replied saying, "That is a photo of me, of a YouTube video that I made of my wood stove that you installed." The installer responded again, saying that he found it on an installers group on Facebook and saw it on another HETAS installer's site. So I said I was a bit confused as to why my video is being used in or as a HETAS training video, and that I quite obviously am not a HETAS engineer, and I asked for a link to this supposed video. This was the installer's response, basically saying that it was a mistake. The installer confirmed again that it was compliant, but he also offered installation of a heat shield if we were concerned about it. I can't explain what happened here. Like I said, it was incredibly weird, and to me, it felt very odd and a bit creepy, and my wife offered to help. She contacted the installer asking for written confirmation from the manufacturer that our wood stove was compliant, and if that couldn't be provided, confirmation from the manufacturer that the heat shield would make it compliant. The installer responded with this, and from what I can tell from the email trail, bearing in mind this was over 3 years ago now, I don't think we ever got any confirmation from the manufacturer, but after a few weeks of my wife chasing up information, eventually we decided just to go with the heat shield option and get on with our lives. That heat shield, which is basically 2 sheets of black metal fixed to the wall, was installed in 2023, and we thought that was going to be the end of it. After that, we had another couple of winters using our wood stove, all cozy and warm. That was until July 2025 when we got a letter from HETAS saying that they had concerns around our wood stove installation. I called HETAS immediately and asked for more information, and they basically told me that there had been an incident with an installation that had been completed by the same installer as ours, and that the installer was no longer registered with HETAS. They told me to get a competent person to inspect our installation and to report back to them once it had been inspected, and not to use our wood stove until it had been checked. And they also gave me a list of HETAS registered businesses that were local to our area. So I contacted one of them and they visited a few days later. They went up into our loft, they had a look on our roof and obviously looked at the stove itself and basically gave us a list of issues with our installation and why it was not considered by them to be compliant with HETAS regulations. I asked if they could provide a quote for the work in order to make it compliant and they said they would be happy to provide one. Our main concern at this point was about who would pay for work to put things right, considering we've basically done everything right at this point, hiring an installer who was HETAS registered at the time and having all of the necessary HETAS certification. While waiting for our quote for remedial works, on July the 30th, they asked me to complete an online questionnaire and to provide an itemised list of rectification works from the company that visited to inspect it. I think HETAS should have been the ones engaging with that company. It didn't feel good asking this company to basically complete extra work, considering there was no guarantee that this company would actually get appointed to do the work in the long run. And they'd already visited, inspected and provided a quote at no cost to me or HETAS. They were happy to assist though, so I completed the HETAS questionnaire and sent them a report from the company on the 1st of August. The quote that the company provided showed everything that needed to be done to make our installation compliant. Before we take a look at that list of things that are unsafe, something else that is unsafe is your and my data on the internet. 5 months ago, I signed up with Incogni, a personal data removal service which contacts data brokers on your behalf and legally forces them to delete your data from their databases. Since signing up, Incogni have found 138 instances of my private data online and it has removed or is in the process of removing every single one of them. There are thousands of these data brokers online who are quietly collecting and building profiles on you who can then sell that data not only for the purposes of annoying spam emails, cold calls and targeted advertisements, but also for scams and other nefarious activities. You can contact those data brokers yourself and request the removal of the data, but the process of finding out which data brokers have your data, figuring out how to request its removal, and continually monitoring the situation to make sure your data doesn't get acquired again in future is time-consuming and cumbersome. Incogni makes that process quick and easy. There's also a new custom removal feature, which allows you to report websites that you've found with your information on to Incogni so that they can take action. For 60% off the cost of an annual plan, use the promo code on screen now. Now let's get back to that list. Apparently the corner heat shield was incorrectly fitted as it was in contact with the skirting boards with no 25mm air gap. It was also not mechanically fixed, instead it had been installed on magnetic catches. The flue had been installed tight to the plasterboard ceiling and a ventilated collar was recommended instead of the solid metal ceiling plate that had been fitted. There was no mesh guard around the flue in the loft space. I think that's just for safety if anyone happens to be up in the loft space when the wood stove is on. But most importantly, there were no roof support brackets fitted to rafters at the flue exit point, and as the external flue extends more than 1.5 meters over the roof, restraints should be installed to support the flue. And those last two were the main concerns, I think, and when I was speaking to the company that inspected, they basically said that the weight of the flue was simply resting on top of our wood stove. So if we ever wanted to replace the stove, it'd be a complete nightmare because the flue would basically be completely unsupported. And finally, no data plate fitted. I discovered a little bit later that we were actually provided with a data plate, it just hadn't been installed. The cost of the remedial works was quoted at £1,655 plus VAT. A couple of days after sending HETAS all the information, they sent me an email to say that they wanted one of their own HETAS inspectors to visit and do an inspection, which is how we ended up with this lovely sign. I don't understand why they didn't just arrange that in the first place, rather than wasting the time of both myself and the company that came here to quote for remedial works. But anyway, that visit was scheduled for a couple of weeks later and the HETAS inspector spent a couple of hours here and then gave us another document which basically consisted of exactly the same information that the other company had already provided. A few days passed and we got this email from HETAS which asks us to obtain a quote for the remedial work that needs to be undertaken. So I sent them the quote that I had already received and asked what the next steps would be. They sent me this email and then I didn't hear back from them again for a few weeks. So I sent them a follow-up email explaining that we were keen to get this resolved before the cold weather creeps in. And on the 2nd of September, we then got an email saying they were in communication with the original installer's legal team, and that as they were still trading, even though no longer registered with HETAS, they were responsible for rectification or the costs to ensure a compliant installation. Once again, I didn't hear anything for a few weeks, so on the 18th of September, I chased them again and got this response, which basically suggests that there's a lot of legal stuff going on in the background and that the original installer had made inquiries about putting the work right themselves. We had concerns about the original installer coming back to do the work, considering they were the ones who hadn't done things right in the first place, but HETAS was saying that any works completed by them would need to be inspected by HETAS to confirm everything was compliant. The email also stated that if the original installers didn't complete the work, that they remain responsible for the costs of putting things right, even if that means paying another HETAS registered installer to complete the work. There was also a paragraph in there about HETAS having no authority or enforcement powers, which to me sounds like arse covering. At this point, it felt like this was just going to drag on forever. The idea of a winter without our wood stove was not appealing, so I decided to really start pushing for some answers. I asked HETAS who was accountable for putting things right, the original installer or trading standards. I also wrote to the original installers because on the basis that any work they completed would need to be signed off by HETAS anyway, that seemed like it might be the quickest solution to get things sorted, and they were quick to respond saying they were keen to put things right, but they were waiting for confirmation from HETAS about the rectification works. A few more weeks passed, more emails, more phone calls, but nothing that really adds to the story. It was basically just me chasing my tail, to be honest. But in the meantime, the original installer said they could do the remedial works on the 6th of October, pending HETAS approval. On the 1st of October though, I got this email from HETAS which basically raised more questions. It suggested that we had a choice of either the original installer coming back to complete the work, but with the caveat that A, they may no longer have any public liability insurance, which is obviously an issue, and B, we would need to seek recertification via building control. Or the other option, HETAS could share details of other registered installers to quote for remedial works, completely ignoring the fact that we had already had a registered company provide a quote and given it to HETAS. This email also stated though that HETAS would fund the cost of the works, which was obviously a big relief to us. So I sent them this email to seek further clarity, checking about the liability insurance and certification sign-off, and reminding them that we'd already provided a quote from a registered installer. I then heard nothing back from HETAS for several days. I phoned, I left messages, I emailed, I got nothing back. Out of desperation, I even looked up the top people in charge at HETAS and sent emails to them too, which they completely ignored. I still don't have a response from them to this day. October the 6th, which was the day when the original installer was meant to come and do the remedial works, came and went, and both me and the original installer had no idea what was going on. That was until the 7th of October when I received an email from HETAS saying that a purchase order would be raised on that day, not for the original installer, but for the other company that had come here, inspected and provided a quote for those works. That didn't happen though, as I checked with the company and they had received no such purchase order. So I chased them again the following day and was told it would be raised that morning. That morning came and went and no purchase order or confirmation was received. That afternoon though, we finally got confirmation that the work would be going ahead, and I arranged a date with the new installers to come and do the remedial works, which by the way is happening tomorrow. Reflecting on this whole situation, I spent countless hours on this, and the process for getting things resolved was incredibly slow and frustrating, and I bet if I hadn't kept pursuing it with such urgency that this probably would have dragged on for months and months, well into the new year. I feel like I'm constantly sharing nightmare stories about tradespeople on this channel, and it's not my intention to do that. We just seem to have a bad habit of picking the ones that end up giving us the worst possible experience, unfortunately. That said, like I said earlier in the video, the original installers were very pleasant to deal with, and I have no hard feelings towards them. In fact, I almost felt sorry for them at one point. I don't know why they got so many things wrong, whether they were deliberately cutting corners or making mistakes. Who knows? Thanks for watching.